an effort to bring people to the school from other fields than architecture who have something to give the work that we do in this building. The lecture is funded by the department and the school, faculty, alumni. Our speaker tonight is the curator of painting at Boston Museum of Fine Arts, at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and he was director of the Getty Museums from 1983 to 2000, and lead client for their architecture. John is an expert scholar of Dutch painting, and in particular, the rivaled work of Jan Steen. We look forward to your questions. There are architects somewhere who do really value painting and sculpture equally with the art of architecture. But I don't know who they are or where they are, except for me. In the Renaissance, they were often the same people. The sculptor Donatello is said to have challenged the architect Brunelleschi to sculpt a better crucifixion than the one he had just completed. Later, Donatello was so astonished by the architect's version that he dropped an apron full of eggs, which is intended for their lunch. That's in Santa Cruz. Architecture, painting, and sculpture, once fungible talents, are now separate, opposed, and eye each other uneasily. Even Matisse couldn't bring off a little chapel with his glorious painting and drawing. While Richard Serra told Frank Gehry, architecture isn't even an art at all because it has toilets. From these battles to protect aesthetic territory, I can definitely report that only two kinds of museums emerge: the Artists' Museum and the Architects' Museum. In the first, everything is done to convince, protect, and show off the individual work itself, which arrangement is sanctified by the elevated public defender of art, Paul Curator. He may establish, or she may establish, a little new building inside the space left over by the architect. This is a special case of the Painters Museum, in that it ups the ante for control by curation. Not a word. It is now. This is a special case of the Painters Museum because it's controlled by curation. It is a smallish, virtual museum created for each exhibition. Too much architecture or view, or even safe sun, is to be avoided, though the intrusion of earthly atmosphere can be an asset. Think of the Garden of Courts at the National Gallery or Fountain Hall. In the Architects' Museum, the total experience is involved in support of the idea of seeing painting, but not with seeing the individual painting itself. Articulated space is here thought to provide a potent context designed to release from the work otherwise obscured meanings and resonances. Instead of mute paintings hanging in a row, the message of each speaks out by resolving its place in a larger shaped space. The organization in such space is made of entry, view, circulation, scale, and structure, with light. There's a different Chinese vase for every minute of the day, so it's with sound and rhythm, with presentation of surface, but only by indirection has it to do with any singular work of art. All dome space has these qualities too, but not composed into significant poetic form. A special case of the Architects Museum is a renovated existing structure, a huge space like our temporary contemporary or the Tate in London. The museum designed by Scarper in the old castle of Verona shows how art can seem the natural culmination of historically constructed form. Now imagine instead the creation of the most important and ambitious new campus for the arts, the size of a university, sequestered on top of a live oak mountain with a view of the Pacific. Our speaker was the prime client of the Getty's two museums for 17 years, but still only one among several institutional interests competing for the world's largest private partners in gallery. Imagine, if you can, the swelling power of the big architect, maddened by the most epic and juicy of commissions in memory, propelled by a righteous talent, and certain of the pure way to posterity. The architect of formidable presence and accomplishments meets the museum director and curator of equally formidable experience, knowledge, and an eye sharpened by the companion effort of assembling major collections of both European paintings and antiquities. Some say the encounter reminded them of Beowulf and Gwendolen, confronting each other under the limb. But which was the hero? This is the kind of classic confrontation that has already deepened our conversations about art, architecture, and museums. None among us can speak to these larger issues with more depth, erudition, historical poise, constrained wit, mastered curatorial experience, while possessed of a well-mannered instinct for name chance than John Walsh.
Richard, thank you. That's something between getting the Legion of Honor and the Grammy. I remember the speaker who, after being introduced by you and giving his lecture here, went out and tried to kill himself because he hadn't done nearly as well as you had. I wish you had kept going. My subject is museums as clients for architects. I feel tremendously honored to be here giving a lecture named for you, Richard Weinstein, and more than a little bit cheeky talking about this subject with you in the room. Dean Weinstein knows more about clients than I do, having wisely gotten an advanced degree in clinical psychology before he turned to architecture. He knows them from the inside, you might say. As a practitioner, he's helped architectural clients understand their obligations in the peculiar relationship that they enter into with those who design buildings for them. He's organized searches, he's helped match up projects to architects, he's been a kind of marriage counselor. He's seen everything go wrong and some things go brilliantly right. He will be the best critic of what I have to say today. I'm not going to be autobiographical in this talk, despite having had some very happy experiences as a client, including with some people sitting in this room. Instead, I'm going to talk about a couple of case histories of architects and clients that will remind us all of how basic and familiar many of the architectural issues are, and you could say how little of the human stuff involved is ever truly new. The clients I'm going to describe were both individuals. They weren't institutions, both devoted art collectors, and both in the grip of powerful ideologies. They had strong reasons to collect art and to show it to the public, and both of them had advisors, forceful, articulate people with strong beliefs of their own. These clients had architects, finally, who were each not only great designers, but also wily tacticians. Architects who knew how to get what they believed in. The first of these projects, the Glyptothek in Munich, opened in 1830 and was one of the first buildings designed to serve as a public museum. These buildings were born of the Enlightenment. They were born out of ideas about the perfectibility of humans and even of society. Museums and libraries were going to be the symbols of a new order, of a rational and a generous and glorious society. 50 years earlier in France, even before the Revolution, a few architects, as you architects know well, were thinking big. They had no client. All the better, not to be designing to build, but to create possibilities. Boulet's famous design of 1783 embodies that Enlightenment dream of a perfected social order. It's a building meant for a museum and a hall of fame. So you're going to see both the products of great minds and the people responsible for the ideas. The museum proclaims a political ideal that a rational, generous government can actually build institutions for the good of all. It expresses the grandeur of the state and also its rationality in its perfectly symmetrical plan. It is really imperial Rome, imagined and perfected, and also an extreme romantic response with dizzy scale, great distances, vast human ambition, and striving in the spirit of the prince of ancient Roman buildings on the bottom by Piranesi, which were made 20 years before and circulated everywhere. Designs like these by Boulet were not meant to be built, but they were meant, as I said, to be published and could be there stirring the imagination on paper. In fact, they were a source of ideas for the shape and the language of museum buildings all through the next century. They gave Napoleon visions for his imperial Paris, too. Not to mention the Duce and the Führer for the totalitarian architecture of Italy and Germany, in their scale and ambition and their actual stripped down, pumped up neoclassical forms. There were more practical approaches to museums, more realistic proposals like this by Durand, with symmetrical ground plan, a domed central hall, Pantheon again, wings with half-round windows patterned on Roman bath windows, and inner courtyards. The layout here is the essence of the Glyptothek in Munich and dozens of art museums afterward. This museum, the Glyptothek in Munich on the top and the Altes Museum on the bottom, the Altes Museum in Berlin, both opened in 1830, each commissioned by enlightened rulers who profited by the example of the Louvre, which you'll remember was not a happy one. Turning the Louvre Palace into a public museum had been conceived by the king's ministers, but not carried out until after the revolutionaries had hijacked the project and guillotined the king. A story that other kings thought a good deal about. Both museums were built, these, to symbolize a more modern kind of monarchy, concern for educating a broader population. Both were given prominent sites in the city and designed by the best German architects of the day. The Glyptothek was designed specifically to show Greek and Roman sculpture, which was the consuming hobby of the client, actually the owner, Ludwig, the Crown Prince of Bavaria, who not only collected sculpture but also commissioned buildings and monuments all over Bavaria, dedicated to the glory of Bavaria to German history and its heroes, the Valhalla in Regensburg. On the Danube, he had his architect Leo von Klenze design a virtual replica of the greatest building he knew, the Parthenon, for statues of German heroes, going all the way back to Alaric the Visigoth. There is the client himself, enthroned, Ludwig, who had himself shown wearing not a crown, but a toga. Every inch the benevolent ancient ruler that he wanted to be. When he was still crowned prince, Ludwig here, was a serious student and traveler, and also carouser. He spent most of his time living in Rome among young German artists, and took an interest in archaeology, more and more in Greece particularly, and he was collecting. In 1812, he bought sculptures from the pediments of the 5th century temple at Egina, and this settled him on the idea of a museum of antique sculpture, which his court librarian invented a Greek name for. Not Pinakothek, a painting collection, but Glyptothek, a sculpture museum. Back home, here, Ludwig had a design made for the city just outside the old medieval and Renaissance core of Munich on the lower right that included some bold moves, including a great boulevard leading through a roundabout with an obelisk all the way to a square that was fronted by a ceremonial city gate with a Greek name, the Propileon, and the new Glyptothek. That was going to form a kind of character, a kind of distinct district for the arts, accessible yet set apart, laid out on a grid that would provide literally golden opportunity for residential and commercial development very soon. Not the last case when clients would put a museum where it would be a magnet for development. In 1814, Ludwig held a competition for the design of the Glyptothek. It's the first formal architectural competition for a museum anywhere, as far as I know. He said he wanted the following. He said he wanted to make of Munich a city which would be such an honor to Germany that no traveler would leave Germany without having seen it. That could be the mayor of Bilbao or Denver speaking. Ludwig's program was terse. He wanted a building suitable for sculpture, quote, in purest Greek style with a Doric portico. The winner was Leo von Klenze, who soon became Ludwig's main architect. Klenze knew how to play the competition game, and he submitted not only the Greek design that won and that was asked for, built, but also using the same ground plan, these two alternative facades in Roman and Renaissance styles, just in case Ludwig should change his mind and prefer to present himself as a Medici or Hadrian instead. Klenze had training in Paris under Durand, so it's no surprise that his plan on the right is copied from the Durand scheme. In fact, it's just a quarter of the Durand scheme. A single story with an inner court and galleries all around, rooms of varying sizes and shapes. The main thing here, from the point of view of installation at least, is the lighting. The walls have high windows based on those of ancient Roman bath buildings, and the diffused light that comes in from the side, high on the wall, is beautiful in a way that is particularly favored by sculptors, that gives a lively light that's perfect for bringing out the subtle modeling of sculpture, as sculptors themselves have always known. This is Bertel Thorvaldsen's studio, the most famous sculptor of his day. Ludwig, the client, felt free to ask advice from other people besides his architect. He asked it from an artist and architect in Rome, Martin von Wagner, himself quite a distinguished man, and this provoked a debate with the architect Klenze over Ludwig's basic program. Whom is the museum intended for, was the question. Specialists or the general public? And how much of the collection should you show? How assertive should the gallery interiors be? Now, Wagner believed in showing less and building a building for art that was functional, not ornamental. Function being to make the works of art beautiful. He proposed that there be just 3 or 4 pieces per room arranged by subject. The light should be from the north only. The gallery should have simple gray-yellow walls, no patterns on the floor. Wagner said, any ornament, anything gay in color and glittering does damage to works of art. He said, if you visit a collection of ancient sculpture, you go because of the ancient sculpture, not for the building. He went on, polished marble walls and floors are an attraction only for the common rabble. Well, he also said, one recognizes the merit and talent of an architect by the strict coincidence of the building with its function. It is my principle to prefer utility to beauty in case the two cannot be united. So there's a whole complex of issues for the next 2 centuries to chew on. The decor, I should say, the distracting decor that von Wagner worried about was typified by these galleries in the Pope's private museum in the Vatican, which were, and still are, lavishly decorated with colored marble and mosaic floors. Klenze, the architect, however, had Ludwig's ear. To von Wagner's purism, von Klenze responded, a museum is not a place for artists' training, but a place in which to show a number of treasures of art to all kinds of visitors in a manner worthy of the objects and to create pleasure in them. Von Klenze's portico was unmistakably that of a Greek temple. The idea of an art museum as a temple or a church is such a cliche today. The idea of museum going replacing church going as a regular spiritual practice. It's so familiar that we may forget that it first arose somewhere and somewhen, and it was Germany and it was now, or a little before. In 1768, Goethe described visiting the Royal Gallery in Dresden this way. Goethe wrote, the hour when the gallery was to be opened arrived, and I entered into the sanctuary, a room in which splendor and refinement reigned together with the deepest tranquility. The dazzling frames, the polished floor, the spaces for spectators rather than for works of art, imparted a unique feeling of solemnity, which much resembles the sensation with which one enters a church. Since the adornment of so many temples, the objects of such adoration seem to be displayed there only for the sacred purposes of art. So Goethe puts his finger on what museums have been doing with art, not just desacralizing art, but also re-sacralizing religious art, putting it in a new kind of sanctuary, making it the object of another kind of reverence. And what kind of art is Goethe talking about? Above all, he's talking about the sculpture of antiquity and the paintings of the Renaissance. More and more, it was Greek sculpture that had the highest rank, thanks to the work of this man on the right. And this is Johann Winkelmann, who is the first great model for art historians and museum curators. He was a Prussian scholar at the Vatican, whose books influenced every educated person in Europe. From him, in Winkelmann's understanding, Greek art embodied an ideal of beauty that came not just from skill, but from virtue. His contemporary Immanuel Kant put it clearly: beauty is the symbol of the morally good. Working at the Vatican, where the greatest collection was, you can see here Apollo, Belvedere, a Roman copy of the Greek original. Winkelmann was studying the material, inspecting new finds from excavations, writing books, and picking up cash by serving as a guide for every important visitor to Rome. The corollary was that by contemplating the beautiful, you will strengthen your inclination to be good. And if you're a good individual, you will contribute to a healthy and cohesive society, one that can be united around higher purposes and be generous to all of its members. And this belief has been paraphrased over and over again ever since as a justification for public art museums and public expenditures for art. Winkelmann believed that the history of art was more than just a collection of anecdotes about artists. It was a way of tracing the development within societies and on a larger scale the rise and fall of civilizations, which he believed would be evident in a well-ordered museum. And as for his own society, the Europe of the Enlightenment, he wrote, "The only way for us to become great, if that indeed is possible, is to imitate the ancients. The art of the present is frivolous," he said, "because our values are corrupt and society is in decline. To recover in the future, artists must look back and must study and embrace the Greek ideal." That didn't mean literal imitation, but it meant adaptation in Winkelmann's sense, adaptation in an imaginative way. It was Winkelmann's ideas that directly influenced Ludwig's collecting of Greek art and on von Klenze's building and its arrangement. Now, old views here on the left in particular show sculptures with light from high windows, ideal light, as we saw, with very few distractions. This is a Roman gallery, which was decorated with the most elaborately. Others were simpler, showing that the architect and the client generally ignored the objections of the critic of Wagner. These beautifully decorated rooms were all demolished by the bombings during World War II and reconstructed in a relatively simple way, plainly, in a sort of modernist spirit, with no attempt to reconstruct the original program of decoration. Despite this grave loss, it's still a very effective place, now still the most beautiful place to look at sculpture that I know. And it's, frankly, more what Wagner advocated, no rich materials, no distractions. I want to add just a couple of remarks about the debates in the 1820s and 30s over this museum and its function, and show you, by the by, how modern it all sounds. On this plan, you may have noticed that there's the main entrance here with its great temple facade. Out back, there's also an entrance, a porte cochere. The public entered by the front door, and the back entrance was a private carriage entrance for Ludwig and his guests. And he instructed von Klenze to include that, because he planned to use the bibliothek for entertaining candlelight parties with lots of wine and music, like the ones that had been given by princes that he visited when he was in Rome. His professional advisor, Martin von Wagner, wrote him that social events like this would be scandalous. He said it would, quote, turn these masterpieces into a sort of furniture. Of course, he lost the argument. Ludwig, who was now king of Bavaria, started giving parties 2 years before the building was opened. Previews, we call them. This all seems very up to date. In fact, the trade-off between museums favoring rich patrons and serving the whole population is never going to go away. Or whose priorities, for that matter, whose priorities and whose taste is likely to win out, that tends to be the person who's paying, whether a prince or a board chairman, then as now. In Munich, the debates often involved the architect von Klenze, who was a shrewd player. He wanted to have the galleries decorated by artists that he approved of, but he didn't want anything else in the galleries that would distract attention from the sculptures. For Klenze, that included labels. Ludwig's advisor von Wagner believed earnestly that visitors should have the chance to learn something on the spot about what they were seeing, and he argued to Ludwig that the statues had to be labeled. But in the end, unclassicized way, no labels. Wagner thought that visitors should be comfortable, that they would enjoy better sculptures and learn more if they could sit. He told Ludwig that there should be seats for visitors so that they could contemplate the works at leisure. The architect won again. When the Glyptothek opened in 1830, the installation was beautiful. There were no seats. The whole process had taken 17 years in Munich, from conception through design, redesign, construction, decoration, installation. 17 years, which was by no means an exceptionally long time for such a project in the early 19th century. The Guggenheim Museum took the same amount of time, which was exceptionally long for many fascinating reasons. I want to read you a letter written to Frank Lloyd Wright in Wisconsin in June 1943. Dear Mr. Wright, could you ever come to New York and discuss with me a building for our collection of non-objective paintings? I feel that each of these great masterpieces should be organized into space, and only you would test the possibilities to do so. It takes so much thought and loving attention and the experience of an originator and his wisdom to handle such a difficult task. In Berlin, I once saw your exhibition, which Mendelssohn arranged, I believe, whose Einstein Tower I witnessed. His functionalism does not agree with non-objectivity. I once met your sister in Westport, Connecticut. She told me you would be interested in our work. I do not think these paintings are easel paintings. They're order. They create order, and they're sensitive and corrective even to space. You feel the ground and the sky and the in-between. You will feel them too and find a way. I need a fighter, a lover of space, an originator, a tester, and a wise man. Your 3 books, which I'm reading now, give me the feeling that no one else would do, if you want to. And so I need your great advice, if you would come, to speak about it, and let me know the expense it would cause. I have never seen a building you made, except in photos, and I feel them, while I felt others' work as much lacking in organic perfection and adapting to the task's originality. I want a temple of spirit, a monument, and your help to make it possible. May this wish be blessed. Signed, Hilla Rabai. Her wish was blessed. Frank Lloyd Wright was hired in 1943 by Solomon Guggenheim's curator and guru, Hilla Rabai, to design a new gallery for the collection that she had been forming for him. It was devoted to a kind of abstract art that she called non-objective, which Kandinsky had called non-objective, exemplified by him. As she explained it, this was not an art of representing the world in more complex ways anymore, like Cubism, but of abandoning the idea of representing anything in the world outside and instead embodying the spirit, speaking to us directly. Paintings like these, and some other abstract artists, couldn't be understood by intuition, she said, paraphrasing Kandinsky. They couldn't be grasped by rational analysis. They needed to be seen in a contemplative setting. If they were, they would affect us the way music does, through their form and structure and color. According to this conception of art, paintings operate directly through our senses, and they appeal to our spirit. And though these paintings, through them, we could become whole beings, free of our materialist attachments and habits. And once free of those encumbrances, we could form a healthier, more generous society. Well, if all that, those ideals of Kandinsky, sound something like Winkelmann's ideas a century later, it's not an accident. And both of them believed in the elevating power of art. I ideal beauty for Winkelmann and for Ludwig of Bavaria had been created by the soul, that is the soul of the Greek sculptor in this case, for contemplating ancient art would make us and our society virtuous. For Kandinsky and Rabai, not incidentally witnesses to World War I, the artist could cure our hunger for power and territory and material things by moving us to a more selfless spiritual space. When Rabai told Wright, I want a temple of the spirit, she was speaking for this man on the right, Solomon Guggenheim, who literally owned a gold mine and a lot more besides, and in the late 1920s was so smitten by Hilla Rabai's belief that he gave her a perfectly free hand in forming a collection for him. Here she is as a painter herself in Paris. She was a painter until she was 37. She lived in Berlin and spent some time in Paris at a very good moment, right around 1913, 14, where she knew most of the major figures, Léger, Art, Mondrian, Kandinsky, and in particular, Rudolf Bauer, a relatively minor Kandinskian, here on the upper right, whom she took up with and who helped her navigate. She had come to New York in 1927, and she had begun advising Guggenheim already. Here, in 1930, is Guggenheim and his wife, and Hilla Rabai, and also Kandinsky in the middle, at the Bauhaus in Dessau. They were collecting during the decade, in the 1930s, when a group of other New Yorkers had started the Museum of Modern Art and then hired Alfred Barr as director. They leased temporary space for MoMA and were doing a kind of eclectic mix of shows, of art in all media from the post-impressionists forward. Their purposes were far too unfocused for Guggenheim and Rabai, who sat out the formation of MoMA. In the late 1930s, MoMA was building a permanent museum on property donated by the Rockefellers on West 53rd Street, which opened in 1939. Guggenheim and Rabai chose instead to rent their own space nearby in a former car showroom and to show the collection in their own way, which we'll see in a moment. It's hard to imagine what MoMA must have looked like to the audience when the scaffolding came down and the museum opened in 1939. This was the first New York City building of any appreciable size in the so-called international style. And it was certainly the most strikingly novel architectural statement that any museum had ever made. Unlike the new Rockefeller Center nearby, which was richly vast and ornamented with sculpture, MoMA was flat and sleek. It had no trace of ornament. It spread horizontally and it didn't stretch upward, though it seemed almost weightless compared to the buildings around it. It was mostly white. It spoke a language new to American architecture, a foreign language, the language of Corbusier and Gropius of the Bauhaus. Part of MoMA's novelty as a museum was its position on the sidewalk, facing a busy street in Midtown Manhattan. You came in under a portico that could have been the entrance to an office building or an apartment building. And once inside, there was a sort of concierge desk for sales and coat checking and a lobby. And turning the corner, you saw a gallery, and from it you got a view out through the plate glass to a sculpture where the building actually seemed transparent. There were 3 floors of galleries designed for maximum flexibility. Temporary interior walls could be built and rebuilt at will, depending on the show and the materials shown. On the 3rd floor, the sculpture was shown at the back, under a skylight. It actually didn't survive renovations later on. And there was an elegant members' lounge on the top floor with all the latest furniture. The point of this tremendously successful building was easy to grasp. You knew that it was about modernity, that it was accessible right on the sidewalk, not up a flight of stairs, sort of above the street like other museums, not elevated but integrated, part of MoMA's purpose was to redefine the notion of modern art, to embrace not only architecture but also industrial design. So it was natural for the MoMA building to look like it could be part of the ordinary pattern of your life, but maybe show you a better version of that life, especially inside where it was elegant in a svelte, well-made way. Once you were inside, the building itself seemed to recede. There was no impressive public space at all. And what got most of the attention was the collection and the exhibitions. About a block away, Rabai and Guggenheim, with the Museum of Modern Art open, were making a different statement. What she called functionalist architecture did not suit the artists they were collecting, she was convinced. Their works create order, you remember she said, and they are sensitive and corrective even to the space they occupy. So this was a strikingly different installation from MoMA's. It was comfortably furnished and carpeted, and the walls were upholstered and pleated with a pleated gray fabric. Light came in from fluorescent bulbs and recessed filter features. There were piped-in Bach and Mozart playing softly. The pictures were in large, plain, silver gilt frames, and not hung at all, but propped up at floor level, and tilted back a little bit so you could see them best when you were sitting down. It was a sanctuary, according to Rabai. What was wanted next, she, Guggenheim agreed, was the temple that you heard her mention. And you heard in her flattering and even seductive letter to Wright, inviting him to design just that. There were a lot of reasons why Wright accepted the conspicuous building in New York, where he'd never yet built. But one thing was the client, not some committee or government body, but one very rich man. And Wright had already several ideas of simmering in his head about a monumental public building. But before unveiling this unveiling in 1945, a great deal happened among the threesome that you see in the picture looking happy together. There were a few snags. Guggenheim had set a budget of $1 million for everything, including the price of the site. And there was no site. Wright was new to New York, and what he knew of his dirt and congestion and traffic, he didn't like either. So the previous summer, he turned for help in finding a site to the man he said, quote, had the future of New York not only in mind, but in hand. Robert Moses, the vice commissioner and supervisor of construction of the city. Moses showed him around and showed him some impossibly expensive midtown sites, and then took him to the site that they both loved. Not in Manhattan at all, but across from the tip of the island in Riverdale, in the Bronx. Moses had built parks all along the Upper West Side, all the way north to this point. Built the Henry Hudson Bridge that you see. And on the other side of the Harlem River, Moore Park, where Moses promised 8 acres for the Guggenheim. Pitching this idea to Rabai and Guggenheim, Frank Lloyd Wright said that the museum would be, quote, a hill crown, a treasury for the collection. Besides, it had a train station nearby, and what's more, it would provide what he called, it'd provide amply for both helicopters and cars. Here's a glimpse you get of Wright and Moses, these prophets of unfettered transportation, mainly transportation out of the city in cars and trains and private helicopters to cleaner, safer places. It would be a monument and a park of what Wright called a retreat from the cinder heap that New York is bound to become. He didn't say so, but it would also be near Rockefeller's new medieval museum in Fort Tryon Park, across the river, and a challenge to it, possibly. Anyway, moving to the Bronx did not please Guggenheim or Rabai, who didn't want to be across a toll bridge from Manhattan, where, as Rabai put it, people without money, and they are the most, could never see it. Manhattan it would be, and in 1944, Rabai found the first of a row of buildings on Fifth Avenue between 88th and 89th, here on Fifth, Park, that Guggenheim managed to buy during the next 7 years to control that whole block front. Wright's spiral that you know so well had been in his mind a long time. He had actually imagined some 20 years earlier using a spiral to here at the top, wrap around an artificial hill with a ramp for cars to reach a viewpoint. But this project for Gordon Strong never got built. It seemed both ancient, spiral, like a ziggurat, and machine age modern, especially since it was being used by Albert Kahn and others to get cars up and down in city parking garages. For the experience of art, an interior spiral might actually have some advantages for the Guggenheim project, so thought, right, including an elevator trip all the way to the top, and then a gradual descent to a communal space at the bottom. Wright's proposals had the appeal to Rebai and Guggenheim of being unconventional, to put it mildly. They were a genuine response to Rebai's ideas. In fact, later on she claimed that she had suggested the circles to him. The soaring space inside would be Wright's realization of Rebai's wish for what she called a sacred dome of the spirit. They were also intended to encourage a totally new way of seeing. Instead of conventional walls and the conventional enclosure of rooms, the architect imposed a single continuum, a one-way trip as a way to condition the visitor to a new kind of painting. Instead of negotiating a stack of boxes, as at MoMA, you'd rise to the top, then move gently and forward and down, as Neil Levine says, on a kind of endless wave. What we don't see today at Guggenheim is what Wright intended for the ramp. In fact, the truth that he intended the Guggenheim to be a very comfortable place. This may seem strange, given the hard surfaces and the noise and bustle that we experience now, but it was sincere. Wright proposed a much more intimate, accommodating treatment of the great spiral rim. As you can see in these drawings, there were to be bays created with these little half walls. He followed the Rebai idea that paintings would not be actually hung on the wall, but would be resting on a kind of low plinth, as they had in the Museum of Non-Objective Painting, and be tilted back a bit to catch the daylight coming through this continuous ribbon of this recessed skylight that would be winding around the building, and still does. He put great effort in designing an integral skylight and electric light system, and that tilt would encourage you to stand close, or better yet, sit on the upholstered seats that he designed to be here and there. I should have said that Wright did not like Guggenheim's collection of non-objective art at all. Neither did his friend Robert Moses, by the way, who did a lot to help get the project built, nevertheless. But Wright did like very much the idea of creating a great public space where all kinds of people could not only have private experiences and works of art, but also congregate, socialize, talk. That's, you can see what people are doing here, not merely looking in quiet reverence, but socializing. For Wright, although he talked about a temple, there was nothing solemn about this experience. In fact, when he came into the drawing, he said, by someone who was there, that when he came into the drafting room and saw the man working on this drawing, showing the little girl with her hand here on the parapet, Wright, drew the yo-yo in, so as not to take away some of the suggestion of solemnity. His drawing of the floor at the base of the great drum of space is entitled Reception, and he wanted it to be an agreeable place with upholstered banquettes here, and tables, and comfortable chairs, and a lot of lounging around here suggested around the fountain. A kind of utopial social function was important to Wright and his clients, Rebai and Guggenheim. They saw it not only as a place for individual encounters with art, but a communal space where people would go their own ways on architect and socialize in the lobby. The trouble is that, like most museum architects, Wright didn't imagine the consequences of success. Socializing is easy enough at the Guggenheim. It's concentration that's difficult. Crowds make it distracting visually and often noisy. Standing on an incline, gradual as the Guggenheim incline is, it may have novelty and even excitement going for it, but for many people there are subliminal suggestions to keep moving. If we were doing what Wright and the clients intended, looking at the permanent collection frequently sitting down as Wright intended, we might sense that exhilarating play between art and building that we were meant to more strongly. As it is, I think that kind of exhilaration is relatively rare. Wright refined his designs for 8 years while the site got bigger. He had nervous clients the whole time. Rabai felt that she was never given enough time to study the drawings, and at one point she wrote him that she feared the collection was going to suffer from Wright's assertive forms. Wright persuaded her and Guggenheim to trust him and the design, and they calmed down for a while. In 1945, she was doubtful again, and she suggested that they get some outside advice, maybe a panel of architects like Mies and Breuer and Gropius. Well, Wright wrote to Rabai, the client's museum director after all, a letter that in my experience stands by itself in the annals of architect-client relations. He told Rabai that she is neither intelligent nor true, and that he hopes one day that he can teach her that an organic building knows no division between concept, execution, and purpose. Conceived for purpose, it definitely completes the service of that purpose, or else it fails, ignominious. No details, not even the smallest, can be interjected or interfered with without marring the peace and quiet of the whole concept. He says to her, if you understand this in a painting, why then are you unable to take this in architecture, the mother of art, of which painting is but a daughter? Wright actually managed to outlive his client, Solomon Guggenheim, who died in 1949, and he outlasted Hilla Rabai, who was pushed out by the Guggenheim trustees not long after Guggenheim's death in 1952. She was succeeded by a very different kind of director, not an artist, not an artist. Oh, I see. I'm pushing buttons. See? Pushing buttons on the computer. And on this. Sweeney, James Johnson Sweeney, was a curator from Harvard and the Museum of Modern Art. An intelligent, resourceful, thoroughly experienced man in the practicalities of running a modern public museum, none of which Rabai ever was. And he was interested in a lot wider swath of modern art and contemporary painting and sculpture than Guggenheim ever was. He wasn't in awe of Frank Lloyd Wright, and more to the point, he was not at all keen on the design. Being used to MoMA-style flexibility, not to mention square corners, he was going to have to wrestle Wright's design into a shape for a more diverse and evolving collection. He hated the sloped walls, and he couldn't imagine leaning paintings back to catch the light. The history of the museum for the next 6 years until the opening was one of struggle between Wright and Sweeney over practical stuff, program changes, like adding facilities for administration, conservation, photography, carpenter shop, more storage, and so on. The budget, the colors. Sweeney worked for the chairman, Harry Guggenheim, now the actual client, nephew of Solomon, the actual client whom Wright appealed to frequently around Sweeney's back. Appealed to him in the name of his dead uncle, who, Wright said, would have hated the changes that Sweeney was asking for. Harry Guggenheim worked both sides adroitly, but finally, as the building was under construction, he wrote to Wright a letter of almost Lincoln-esque eloquence. At the end of a long letter full of particulars rebutting Wright's claims, Guggenheim wrote, "Cease your diabolical maneuvers. Because your building is built for the angels, Stop causing everyone, including yourself, quite unnecessary bile and labor. Let us finish this job that your cussedness would have killed a borning without our help. And help us dedicate in harmony your beautiful and ingenious pile to an eager world. Wright not only ceased, but he died before the opening. When the museum finally opened in October 1959, the building was quite different from what had been intended, mainly where display is concerned. Paintings hung straight up and down, and there was sculpture, carefully shimmed up to compensate for the slope. In 1962, there was a new director, Tom Messer, and a new program of loan shows that much of the time displaced the permanent collection that had been the whole motive for the building, and that often struggled hard against the building. The story since then includes a new addition, another new director, a worldwide expansion, and even more contemporary involvements, and a thorough renovation of Wright's building. All that is another story. But the Guggenheim still bulges away from the parade of Fifth Avenue apartment facades, just as it did in 1959. It's got that belligerent strangeness that the late Ada Louise Huxtable identified back then. At the same time, from the Wright viewpoint, it's the temple in the park that Wright always called it. It's also a record of harmony and struggle between client and architect, between form and purpose, between change and stability. It seems to be typical, as far as I know, of every successful museum building. Thank you. So, is there a mic for me? Well done. If you have a question, please say it loud and clear.
John. Wonderful. The 17 years it took for the Guggenheim to be built, and the 17 years that it took the Glyptothek to be built, is just too good to be true.
Yes.
Because it's exactly how long it took the Parthenon to be built.
John, can you think of another project that took 17 years?
Well, that was my next question.
Here's another.
Exactly.
Michael, can you think of another? Yes, he can. Michael Palladino, the Richard Meier and Partners, raises his finger and says, yes, there was another one. And yeah, the Getty took I don't know what the numerology is. I think there were very different reasons for the slowness. And in the case of the Getty, it was a very complex, slow design process. I mean, design development process, I would say. I think you guys did the schematics amazingly rapidly, but then, of course, the schematics had to be fitted into a whole process of community approvals, budget, both of which caused it to shrink and change. There was the fire department, and then there was, procurement of materials. Contractors were doing things that they hadn't done before, even on a Richard Meier building. I mean, there were a lot of reasons. We were maybe slow sometimes too, the client that is, but it was different from the Glyptothek, where things went pretty straightforwardly. It's just all the trades worked much more slowly in that case. As to the Parthenon, you'll have to tell us. John was a curator at the Getty of antiquities.
I just wanted to thank you for having an exhibit about the making of the Getty when the museum opened, when the center opened, because in fact I was teaching Greek architecture here at UCLA then, and still do, but I've lost the power to send them up there and ask them to expose the exhibit, which you can organize in different phases of showing them the before, the after, the many workmen, workforces involved, because it allowed them to complete an assignment where in fact they had to compare more than just the 17 years, the relationship between the client, the city, the budget, the complaints from the people, the benefits,
Yes.
that allowed, which I don't know if the museum has ever done, which allowed all of us to appreciate the entire process of making it.
Sarah, thank you.
Well, thank you, and then thank
I'm glad
you
you
for
said that. I was thinking, for you all, I mean, and us too, we had a whole change of generations. I mean, you guys were there from the beginning to end, but a lot of young people came through your office, came in and out of your office, and went on to other jobs while the project went on and on and on. Okay.
I thought it was really interesting, the dialogue between the content and the design. And even though Wright had no affection maybe for the collection, it was a good motor for the design. I'm just wondering if you could give the same talk with an encyclopedic museum, rather than a museum dedicated to such a specific topic as the Guggenheim and looked at that.
I think an encyclopedic museum would be even more gravely handicapped by that kind of linear sequence, unless it just happened to be a museum that could be conveniently arranged in perfect chronological order and explained by a genius. I think the media are so different.
But I'm wondering what kind of a challenge to the architect is an encyclopedic museum?
That is a nice question. We have very few examples of encyclopedic museums designed from the ground up. One big exception, that was Rem Koolhaas's moment of sort of what I think he later called sort of pre-design. He didn't really want to, but for the museum, for the county museum, you remember in about 1990, maybe around 2000, decided to everything must go. I think on the plinth formed by the demolished Los Angeles County Museum of Art, there would be a kind of vast tent, we would call it, maybe even a fabric structure, in which the collections would be arranged in parallel rows by chronology so that it was possible to go chronologically in one direction or geographically cutting through in the other. That was a truly amazing, exciting idea. I think it was completely impractical, even if it afforded it. But, you know, as a thought exercise and design exercise, quite stimulating. I thought a lot of people admired it, even though they knew they couldn't and probably shouldn't be built.
John, I was struck by the moment where museums turn away from the Greek temple and the ideals that stands for, and flip pretty quickly to MoMA and the Guggenheim with a very different and, to my mind, less clear kind of backstory and cultural and political message. Can you say something about why that happened? Was it the war?
I think in some sense it was the war, and all the war brought the confusion, the sort of cacophony, not to mention the kind of general secularism of public institutions everywhere. It wasn't possible to draw a straight line anymore. To the extent that there was a new code, it was progress, it seems to me. And that, however people tried to define it, mainly, where modern art is concerned, the public definer of progress was the Museum of Modern Art, which constructed a kind of timeline of influence and geography that was, everybody knows, very not only influential, widely adopted, and now only in the last 15 or 20 years or so, on account of very different ways of thinking about how the world was shaped, what parts of the world one must consider, high, low, many other hierarchies that we inherited as children. As a consequence of the re-examination of those, MoMA's own notion of progress has become very, very much more complex than it used to be. These great artists are still great artists, but there are very many more great or near great artists than we thought, and the lines of influence are not simple anymore. It's a very extraordinary complex web. The first thing you see when you go to the Museum of Modern Art now, an marvelous, extraordinary exhibition of modernism between 1913 and 1925, is what looks like the flight map for the airline of the future, which there are about, I don't know, what would you guess, 150 or so artists, and the lines of influence between them are mapped. And honest God, it does look like a merger between American Airlines and United Airlines. Real horrible. It's not so horrible as that. So that's a long-winded answer to your question. Others may have other and better suggestions to answer Ron's question. Yes?
I'm just curious, you started with the main thesis of the museum in Munich as putting forth a mission to transform the individual, enlighten, etc. I'm just curious if we could step between maybe the former question about MoMA, Guggenheim, and then today, and maybe your experience. How has that mission fundamentally changed, or has it?
Ideas, anybody? What would you say? Is there an example of an idealist museum built around a clear thesis that involves some element of belief in the value of art? Did you say American Wing? Yeah, you could say that. I mean, there's been a couple of those. The reorganization of the American Wing and that particular new wing in Boston. But that is that a new, do you think the ideas are very new there, or are they just a kind of glorification of the main line of American history as seen by artists and collectors?
I think when it started, it was about, George Washington and Betsy Ross, and it was a time of tremendous immigration, and it was a message to the immigrants that, that they would program.
Yeah. Here's the core culture. Here's what you need to know. Here are the people you need to emulate. Here's the work you need to devote yourself to, and all that stuff. That's true. But there's also a function, perhaps not entirely intended, of artistic exceptionalism. You made of American art something not rivaled and different from, within the rest of the world, different from Europe, certainly. If not quite as refined or sophisticated, that was on purpose. And that was a good thing. That reflected the honest values of an American culture and not the corrupted, over-refined, and corrupt ones. Now, the idea of an isolated American culture during the 19th century has become ludicrous. Most artists wanted to get to American artists wanted to get over there, get trained, and if they got a good offer, on them stayed. They didn't consider themselves, for the longest time, they didn't consider themselves in any way disloyal. And that's a tradition that goes all the way from Benjamin West through Sargent to, I don't know who I was going to say, Hockney, but he went the other way. Other?
Sure, it's well, thoughts of the American Museum. Have you been to the Crystal Bridges?
No. Who's been to Crystal Bridges? No, we have to, this is bad. Don't tell them. An entire room full of people. Don't tell Safdie that a whole room full of people.
But I'm curious.
Yeah, we've been there.
There's some interesting issues there. There's a, incredibly powerful planning commission that is partly popularized and partly setting aside outside the city. It's very conscious of creating a different kind of program. And then a very powerful, strong architect. And it becomes aligned with that. And kind of,
Yes.
Or kind of a medium idea, I have to say. I've never been there, but it seems to me that the whole thing very interesting. Issues very, very consciously put out, whatever one thinks of how well it works for exhibition. And it also engages the notion of, some things I read are the notion of the sort of, not only populism, but the art as creative and presenting entertainment, environment, very relaxed, stop. Where is that?
please go, take pictures, come back, give a lecture. I want to be there. But you're too polite to say that we're laundering a great deal of money there. Putting to good public use large amounts of profit. Earned in extremely tacky architectural quarters, often with the sale of shoddy goods. You didn't say that.
Hi.
Hi.
You went in a really interesting way quickly from Ludwig to Guggenheim and all that. Both were sort of purified visions of an enlightenment aspect or enlightenment leader, and then the purification of art in modern, classic modernist moment. I'd like to just get back to a couple of your comments about crowds and the museum and the architectural spaces, the wow space building that is architectural celebration of a magnet for a public entertainment rather than the enlightenment vision of uplift and moral reform and ideology. So how that tension, I mean, MoMA and Guggenheim are the best examples of that high moment of modernism, but all these examples are things up, of course, more recently, as we know, too well, the museum often operates as a separate shopping mall space because the building provides a wow space for crowds and spectacle.
It's true. It didn't figure in my talk at all. There was actually some debate with Wright didn't like. Wright actually provided a cafe and a theater underneath, you know that. But he didn't like that very much. And Sweeney felt that this needed greater attention, i.e. more space. And there was this dispute over that. The Glyptothek, as you heard, was for entertaining too, but only by the king. I would be interesting to think of a case where an architect and client got into a kind of struggle over this issue of where the architect either had to be the purist or had to be the Philistine, for or against profit. I'll think of it as soon as I knew it. But it is an issue, and you raise the point that it's a reality in museums, and God knows architects have to do a lot of work providing everything along the spectrum from, wow, as you said, I mean, the attraction, like Denver, all the way to toilets and the restaurants and gift shops. Yes.
One more question.
Okay, one more question, please.
I guess I'll ask.
It's yours.
I read an interview a while ago where it talked about the notion of fast space versus slow space in a museum, and that more and more artists are interested in exhibiting in what would be fast space, like the ground floor at MoMA where Marina Abramovich had her retrospective. When you're working on your project, does that come up at all, or is that a relatively new concept?
I don't think so. When we were working on our project, I think we considered it all slow space. But we were designing for a collection of older art, I have to say, and not providing much except a lot of outdoor space for commission work by artists. And Marina Abramovich didn't come up. I mean, although one of the best moments, it seems to be, well, actually, the museum's lobby has not expressed, well, it seems to me. We were organ, we never looked better. Fine from my office. It's fast space, I don't know. Think of newish museums that have experience like this. I think the Walker Art Center wing by Herzog took a leap in providing a lot of performance space, but confined it to a theater. And didn't make any big black boxes or other spaces that would be contiguous to